I'm Rob Phillips, the archivist responsible for the Welsh Political Archive at the National Library of Wales. Today marks 100 years since the signing of the Treaty of Versailles, one of a number of treaties signed in the aftermath of the First World War, but perhaps the best well known. It was a treaty which imposed very harsh terms on Germany, including a restriction on their armed forces, a requirement for Germany to accept responsibility for the war, and also to pay a huge sum in reparations, around about £284 billion in today's money. Now, that peace treaty was attended by a large number of nations, all taking part, but there were four main players. They were Vittorio Orlando, the Prime Minister of Italy, Georges Clemenceau, the Prime Minister of France, Woodrow Wilson, the United States President, and the Welshman David Lloyd George as the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. And because of Lloyd George's involvement, we have a number of very interesting documents at the library which tell the story of the Paris Peace Conference and the subsequent Versailles Treaty from the standpoint of some of the people who were actually there seeing the history being made at the time. We have a wonderful description in the archive of A.J. Sylvester of the first day of the conference. He notes, "Today there were assembled around the conference table the principal representatives of some 27 nations. It was a marvellous and epoch-making assembly which met in the Salle de l'Arche in the Quai d'Orsay. For the first time in history, the press were represented and some 250 journalists were present." And that really sets the scene for what is an incredibly important event that attracts the attention of the world. We have also in that archive an agenda for the first meeting on January the 18th, which notes that at 3:30 p.m. the President of the French Republic will arrive and will then give a speech. This is the list of what happened on day one of a conference that would shape international politics for decades to come. We have here, as well as words painting a picture, we have a photograph showing Lloyd George and Clemenceau in the very room at the Quai d'Orsay at the first meeting of the Paris Peace Conference. Lloyd George's personal secretary, Frances Stevenson, was also along as part of the delegation, and she wrote a number of letters back from Paris to her family, noting how the talks were going and some of the comments she had on them. In April, she writes back to say that while some of the newspapers are concerned about the delay, something really definite will be settled in the next few days, and I have not the least doubt that it will be a good peace, not one that will cause another war in about 10 or 20 years' time. Now, a little bit later on, in June, she is getting rather concerned about the delay and is talking about some of the concerns she has about the French. She said the French are very unreasonable. They don't want to make peace with Germany, and they don't seem to realise that unless the treaty is signed now, there will be Bolshevism everywhere. By far the most interesting letter, I think, in this collection of letters from Frances back to her family is the one she sent on the 7th of May, where she disagrees quite fundamentally with David Lloyd George on the contents of the treaty. She says, "I think it is a just peace. It's stern but not vindictive." But Lloyd George disagrees. The PM says it is a terrible document and there's no such treaty presented to any nation since Carthage. Now, those are very, very strong words from Lloyd George about the treaty, and he wasn't alone, because we have in the collection of A.J. Sylvester, once again, a document marked secret, in which he notes the concerns he has about the outcome of the treaty. He talks about unrest. "Much of this unrest is healthy. We shall never make a lasting peace by attempting to restore the conditions of 1914, but there is a danger that we may throw the masses of the population throughout Europe into the arms of extremists, whose only idea for regenerating mankind is to destroy utterly the whole fabric of society." So it's quite clear that even back in 1919, there were many people who had quite serious concerns about the effect of the treaty on the populations across Europe. Now, the British Empire, of course, had some very, very strong things that it wanted out from the treaty. And this document here, also in the A.J. Sylvester collection, which is marked secret, and it notes that Britain wants strict limitations on German naval strength. And we must also have a large indemnity of Germany as possible to lighten the burden in commercial competition. The British Empire becomes the mandatory power for Palestine, Mesopotamia, East Africa, Southwest Africa and the South Pacific Islands. In a sense, that means we're having those colonies. And consolidation of the British Empire is, of course, a really, really important outcome. So Britain had many things that it wanted from the treaty, and it got most of them. Now, the treaty discussions weren't simply about the dry discussions in rooms, about people meeting. There's also some really interesting discussions and talk in the various documents we have about the social life. We have a postcard back from Frances Stevenson, which she sent back to her family, and she notes there are plenty of nice walks. She also talks about parties, dinners and so on, and we have a wonderful series of photographs showing Lloyd George's family, his wife Margaret and his daughter Meghan. Photographs here showing them at the Palace of Versailles in 1919. So in many ways this was quite a social occasion. There were lots of things happening, lots of people were there, all taking part and all being there to witness the history being made. And there was a great demand to see the history being made. There was a huge interest in seeing the signing of the treaty. Frances writes back to her parents and says that she really wants to see the treaty being signed. And we have a letter to Sylvester, A.J. Sylvester, here noting the details and the arrangements for the signing and telling him that there's only a limited number of tickets, 60 in total, that have been allocated to the British delegation. So whilst there was a great deal of interest, there wasn't a great deal of space for everyone who wanted to see what was going on. But as the treaty was signed, we can concentrate on some of the concerns that were had about the time, but also it's fair to note that there were some quite revolutionary, radical ideas in the treaty which underpin our international relations to this very day. One of which, or the main one of which, was the establishment of a League of Nations. Now, an international agency to bring together nations to discuss international problems may not seem such a radical idea today, but this was the first time it had been attempted, and it was quite a revolutionary plan. This League of Nations would not only be a focus for people, for nations to meet to discuss, it would also outlaw war. It would, for the first time in history, an attack on your neighbour as a country would be illegal. Now there were very many weaknesses with the League, but it does show, and this document here, a secret document with a sketch plan of the organisation, shows an attempt, the very first attempt, to bring a structure of legality and of cooperation and discussion to international relations, which until that point had almost all been about treaties and pacts between countries and nations going off to fight to take possessions away from other nations. This was a very, very welcome development. Back in Wales, it was welcomed by a number of people, especially Major David Davies, the MP from Montgomery, who later became Lord Davies of Llandina. He had long been a campaigner for structure and law in international relations, and he went at it to work with other people to establish an organisation in Wales to support the aims and the objectives of the League of Nations. And that led to the establishment of the League of Nations Union in Wales, which met several times, arranged conferences, meetings, created discussion papers and booklets to promote the idea of international cooperation and international law. And there's a wonderful piece in the minutes of a meeting of the Council of the League of Nations Union in Wales, held in 1922, where it was resolved the Welsh Council League of Nations rejoices in the first meeting of the Permanent Court of International Justice and wishes it Godspeed for work and maintenance of peace amongst the nations of the world. Now, the League of Nations itself may have failed in the period leading up to the Second World War. But next time you hear on the news of a political or a military leader being dragged to the Netherlands to face trial for genocide, war crimes or crimes against humanity, it's worth remembering that principle was established 100 years ago today in the signing of the Peace Treaty of Versailles.